So good morning. Good morning and welcome back to the hall. We are under enormous time pressure this morning, so I'd really like to invite everybody to take their seats so that we can get started. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is a new development here at the YES conference. It's the first time that we do a joint presentation, jointly organized by Victor Pinchuk's team and by my own team, meaning the Munich Security Conference. We've had, in recent years, side events in Munich, sponsored by and organized by Victor, and I think it is our joint idea to build on these great beginnings and to intensify our cooperation. That's why we're here with this co-hosted 45-minute discussion about the European security landscape, the future of Ukraine, the future of European Euro-Atlantic security, etc., etc. So I wanted to just get us started with a word of thanks to Victor for offering this important opportunity to me personally and to the Munich Security Conference team. Secondly, let me just say that recent events actually make me quite hopeful that maybe the relationship between Russia and the West is now moving in the right direction. We have recently seen that there were two Russian men, I assume they are members of the Orthodox Church, who took time out in a very short trip to actually travel to see an Anglican church in England. And they used all the time they had in England to just visit churches. This is actually a very encouraging sign, and I think if this trend continues, we'll be in good shape. Third, to be more serious and to get us really started on our theme, my own personal belief that trust and the operational relationship between Russia on the one hand and the West, whether you think in NATO terms or in EU terms or in Western terms, the relationship really has reached an all-time low, certainly in times of mutual trust or better, mistrust. So the question here this morning is, what, if anything, can we do about it? It's now been 3 years since the Minsk agreement was signed, and we see little, if any, movement at all. I also want to point out to this audience that there is no such thing as an unresolvable conflict between countries. We have recently had demonstrations that conflicts which seem to be unresolvable are resolvable. We have recently seen that Mr. Tsipras and Mr. Zoran of Macedonia have gotten together, and that conflict apparently is now being resolved. We see that there are continuing discussions between Serbs and Kosovars, so there's no such thing as an unresolvable issue, and I think it should be in this spirit that we should be discussing the issues. I have a great panel here this morning. I think these panelists don't need a lot of introduction. We'll start in just a second with Kurt Volker, whom everybody knows here, who has been the senior envoy from the US on Ukrainian issues since more than a year. We have then to his right Michael Gahler from the European Parliament. He's a German member of the European Parliament with important responsibilities on defense and also specifically on Ukraine. He replaces Norbert Röttgen, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the German Bundestag, who was supposed to be here this morning, but whose plane last night was canceled. So thank you, Michael, for stepping in. And then, of course, Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Pavlo Klimkin, good morning, and thanks for sharing this. And last not least, I've asked my old friend Richard Haas, whom you've already seen and who will continue to be on stage at the conclusion of this panel, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. Let me start with Kurt Volker. Kurt, give us your view on what you think the opportunities are to get the conflict here resolved and to de-escalate in a more general sense, and to get and let me have your views about security of countries like Ukraine, who are sort of trapped in between, not members of NATO, and maybe not friends of Russia on the other hand. And I think that's going to be the question I'm asking of all four of you. Kurt, go first, please.
Hello, thank you. Wolfgang, thank you very much for that introduction. I know we are time limited, and so I'll try to organize my thoughts in 3 brief points, if that's possible. The first point I want to make and stress is that this, in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, is an ongoing hot war, and it is having a disastrous effect on the local population. There are tremendous humanitarian issues at stake. Over 10,000 people have been killed. That's more than at Srebrenica. Over 1.5 million people have been displaced. It's probably the largest movement of a European population since World War II. And this conflict is not over, it's not frozen, it's been going on for 4 years, and it goes on every day, every night. And on average, a Ukrainian soldier is killed defending his country every 3 days. Imagine if this were anywhere else in Europe, any other country, a soldier of that country was defending his country inside his own territory and killed on an average of every 3 days. How would our political establishments react to that? So this is a tremendous humanitarian problem. As a consequence of that, I would say there is an imperative for the Ukrainian government to do everything possible, to work with the international organizations, the UN, the Red Cross, everyone possible to try to access that population and provide support to that population. And there's also an imperative on governments around the world, and I especially think of Europe, not to just fall asleep and accept that this is going to happen. It is unacceptable, and we can't allow this to continue. All of our publics, all of our governments, all of our media should be putting a big spotlight on this humanitarian catastrophe that's just a few hours flight from Munich or from Berlin. Second point that I would make, you asked, where's the hope in this? I think we have clarified over the past year quite well what the issue is. This is a Russian-led military force in the Donbass with 2 political entities wholly created and controlled by Russia that is there aimed at putting pressure and changing politics inside Ukraine. So we have tried over the past year to get this out of the weeds and focus on, we need to negotiate with Russia and we need to come to some kind of conclusion. And there is a way forward. We get stuck in the Minsk process, where on the one hand, we talk about political steps by Ukraine, special status, amnesty, local elections, but it is physically impossible to carry those steps out without security on the ground. And that is where Ukraine rightly points out there can't be elections, for example, when it's an occupied territory. So we have proposed a way forward, which is a UN-mandated peacekeeping mission to replace the Russian forces and to create genuine security in the area and create time and space so that those political steps can be taken. Legitimate local elections for legitimate local authorities can be taken, and we can get through this humanitarian disaster that we are now seeing. There is a proposal on the table. We need Russia to take it seriously. Unfortunately, we've not seen much evidence of that, but we are constantly ready. We are prepared to discuss, prepared to negotiate. The third point, I turn it back to you, is that fundamentally, the bigger picture here is a situation where Russia continues to claim a right to determine the affairs of its neighbors, whether it is Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or others. We in the West believe the opposite. We believe it is for the Ukrainians themselves to decide their future, their country, their direction, their alliances. The same with Georgia, the same with Moldova. And this difference in mentality is fundamentally the issue. And the solution, Wolfgang, to the question you posed is we need Russia to accept that it will live within its borders as a peaceful neighbor alongside Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, others. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Could I, before turning to Michael, could I push you a little bit on this Russian question? You've now been engaged in this for more than a year. Is it possible, I should say, is it likely, maybe, that the situation on the ground as it is actually not that uncomfortable for Russia, and that maybe Russia at this moment, because the Russians tend to tell us that they've learned to live with the sanctions, and the pain apparently isn't strong enough. So would you share the view that maybe they will not be prepared to move and to compromise, including on the UN peacekeeping idea, anywhere in the near future? I give you 30 seconds.
I think the Russian leadership has taken that view, that they can settle in and do this for a long time. I think the Russian people, and even some powerful Russian people looking at this, think it is hurting Russia, and they don't understand why Russians are fighting Ukrainians. And I think it is ultimately a deteriorating situation for Russia. You talk about sanctions. Sanctions are having an impact. It is affecting people in Russia. It's affecting people around Putin. It's affecting the way decisions are made. And so I know the Russians put it deliberately forward that argument, oh, it doesn't matter. But the reality is it is making a difference. And the fact that the European Union has been as strong as it has over this period of time is, I think, a great surprise to Putin, and it's imperative that we keep that together.
Thank you very much. Let's go straight to Michael Gahler and have a view from your vantage point as an important member of the European Parliament.
Is this one working? Yes. Well, thank you very much. Well, in principle, I can fully subscribe to what Kurt Volker says, so I need not repeat that. Indeed, from the European perspective, first to let you know, over all these years since the aggression started, Ukraine has become the country outside the European Union that got most financial and expert support from the European Union. So there is a relentless and unwavering support in this regard. I think what is especially and continuously important is that we all stay united, that we keep this position, and that all attempts, regardless whatever current government is in whatever European Union state, and there are the usual suspects, I need not name them, but that we find ways and means to stay together. We have managed thus far, and I'm confident that we'll get there as well. So we'll stay principled on the agenda that we are doing. We have the Normandy format with France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. Indeed, it is stalled. I'm not happy about where we are there, but that is the format to convey messages. I am very much supportive also of this idea to have a UN-mandated strong mission, be it beside the OSCE or instead. But what is decisive is that this mission is definitely would be in control of the entire territory and including the Russian-Ukrainian border. When we ask ourselves, well, what might motivate Russia to change its mindset, I'm convinced that, as you rightly said, it seems to be relatively low cost for Russia simply to infuse always some support to these extremists there in the occupied territories and at this rate keep the conflict burning at this stage, because they definitely don't care for the people who live there or those who have been internally displaced. But I think the costs of this aggression, both politically and financially, they are feelable. I mean, it was already in 2014 that the Russians took $7.2 billion out of their pension fund to finance the Crimea annexation. That was only for this year, and we are in a way also seeing the consequences of the empty pension fund. But on the other side, I think what we should also do is to show them what an alternative could be. I mean, prior to this aggression, we had an ambitious agenda with Russia, be it with, you all know it from the 90s, the free trade area from Lisbon to Vladivostok. We had it planned. We had virtually the same agenda with Ukraine as with Russia in the trade area. And it was foreseen to open such talks. And the potential that Russia is losing out because of not having all that should be made clear politically from our side as well, because they are losing, because they are not having this access to our market to the extent, this exchange, all this potential of innovation, of cooperation. And I think this is a discussion that we have to conduct as well, to show them what they could have if they were realizing that this approach is nothing that serves them. But I'm not illusionist in this regard. I think he will only start reconsidering it once from inside. And that is both from the streets, so to say, could be other issues than the pension issue, both from the street, but also from those who are the profiters from the system, if they really assess their shares and say, well, with the continuation of this policy, at the end we will lose out. We are not there yet, but I think we are on this way, because the long-term consequences of this politics will be felt. As long as we stay united unexpectedly, I think we are in a good chance to change the mind in the midterm.
Thank you, Michael. Turning to the foreign minister, Pavlo, when I listen to our Russian friends, I often get two arguments, and I'd be interested in your reaction. You've heard these arguments. One is the Ukrainians themselves are not doing anything, or certainly not enough, to get Minsk implemented. That's one regular argument we keep hearing. The other one is, if the Ukrainians believe that by relentlessly pushing for NATO membership, I'm quoting Russians, they should not be surprised that there is not going to be an early Donbass resolution. Let me have your reactions to these and other issues.
The mic is on, yeah. Good morning, everyone. Look, firstly, Volkont, I like your point about resolvable and unresolvable conflicts. Maybe you're right, there are no unresolvable conflicts. But what is going on between us and the Russians is about our existence. It's an existential conflict, fundamentally. So it's completely different from anything which is fought for something. And no, it was Golda Meir, if I'm not mistaken, who famously said, to be or not to be is not the point of compromise. So for us, to be or not to be is not the point of compromise. And here, I'm constantly asked the question, Pavlo, can you say, for a sort of orientation, who is more pro-Russian from the presidential candidates, who is less pro-Russian? It's all rubbish from the Russian stance. Because Russia's idea is not to establish a kind of pro-Russian reality or more pro-Russian reality here in Ukraine. It's over. Unfortunately, the Kremlin is too smart for that. The whole idea maybe is a sort of transitional stage, but whatever. The whole idea is to weaken up and fragment Ukraine. So it's a fundamental conflict. And the Kremlin's tactics or, strategy, whatever you would call it, is basically to constantly raise the stakes, ratcheting up this pressure. And the Western strategy, in many cases, was basically to lower the stakes. Whether this asymmetric approach is good, I have my strong doubts. For Russia, Ukraine is existential because any kind of success of Ukraine as a democratic, free, and European country is a total negation to the Russian model. So the whole stuff about Donbass is not about Donbass. Russia does not care about Donbass at all. At all. The whole idea is to use Donbass to try to legitimize reality around Donbass and to push it into Ukraine as a sort of Trojan horse to kick off the process of Russian narrative of federalization, because it's the only way how the Russians are ready to do it. So it's again not the point of compromise. And if you read Minsk agreements, it's very simple. Lavrov famously said during the last Normandy meeting, look, if you get international community into Donbass, it would be an occupation of Donbass. I said, look, an occupation of Donbass by international community under Security Council mandate. My friends, from Germany and France, were laughing a lot. And after that, he said, if it's basically carried out under the umbrella of the international community till the future elections, you will elect the people you want. I said, yeah, but it will be under international umbrella, it will be under the mandate of the Security Council. He said, I don't care. Fundamentally, what we need is basically to exchange a couple of personalities, but otherwise to retain all the structures on the ground. So the problem is not with Minsk agreement. We have fundamentally different vision of how to implement that. And this vision is not a point of compromise. This vision is about high stakes and not about Donbass, but about Ukraine. So it's how I see the whole process around it. And on such issues, which basically, for me, makes the sense of our existence, of my understanding of Ukraine and my vision of Ukraine, there will be no compromise at all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pablo. And I think your last remarks take us straight into the larger picture. Let me remind the audience that Ukraine isn't the only country that has this kind of problem. We have a similar, maybe not identical, but a similar problem in Georgia. As I turn to Richard, again, let me remind ourselves that, 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, we were working on the so-called NATO-Russia Founding Act. And the idea was that there would be a lasting and sustainable security arrangement, I don't dare call it security architecture, that would last and would govern our relationship. In the year 2000, Vladimir Putin came to speak at the German Bundestag, and his main message was, I am here to tell you, Germans, that I want to take Russia westward. and we will have better relations in the future than we had in the past. So, unfortunately, over the last decade, I think beginning with Putin's speech in Munich in 2007, things seem to have gone downhill. Where should we be moving, Richard? What should happen to get us out of this downward slide for over a decade now?
Well, I think you're right, Wolfgang, that around a decade ago, Vladimir Putin decided and certainly articulated a very different foreign policy direction for Russia. And he essentially rejected or turned away from the idea of greater integration with the West, and instead essentially pursued a much more confrontational foreign policy. So rather than integration, again, it was a willingness to use military force, to use energy, to use digital means in order to promote an imperial Russian foreign policy, and one that would strengthen his position at home. Putin does not have a domestic economic or political reform policy. What he has is an imperial foreign policy. So what I think we need to do is raise the costs to him of his imperial foreign policy. There's at least 3 tools that come to mind. One is obviously sanctions. It's been heavily used, but we can continue and need to continue with that. Secondly, something we haven't done nearly enough of is public diplomacy. We should have a regular effort to get inside Russia information about the costs of Putin's foreign policy. What is it costing financially? All the money that Russia is spending abroad in places like Ukraine and Georgia. This is money that could be spent inside Russia to raise the standard of living at home. We should be talking about that. How many soldiers are dying? We should be putting out regularly detailed statistics of the costs of a foreign policy. It's actually very similar to what we should be doing with a country like Iran, also carrying out an imperial foreign policy. We ought to give ammunition, in the political sense, to domestic forces that are questioning the priorities of an imperial regime. So this ought to become a central dimension of our policy towards Russia. Thirdly, we ought to look for ways to directly raise the costs of military aggression. We've done certain things, and I think this administration is more correct than its predecessor in the United States about providing certain arms to Ukraine, but I would be open to providing other arms, and we ought to look at things in the air and naval dimensions to strengthen Ukraine. We're not talking about NATO entry. Ukraine doesn't come close to satisfying the conditions. The option ought to be down the road. But the real issue for now is simply to enhance capabilities. I also think, by the way, as part of diplomacy and the public side of it, is that the Ukrainian government and others ought to be extremely detailed about the political future of those areas inside Ukraine that the Russians are occupying, how they would benefit politically and economically if Russia were to leave, what's in it for them, what degrees of autonomy. And to the extent Putin is worried about reprisals after Russian forces were to leave occupied areas, the planning for peacekeeping forces ought to be very specific. Peacekeeping forces ought to be large and capable, because I actually do think that Putin, who is very worried about how he's perceived, his nightmare scenario, or one of them, would be that Russian forces leave and then there's massive reprisals carried out by vigilante groups or whatever. So again, I think there's an incentive to show that peacekeeping actually could keep the peace. Let me just make one other point, because Wolfgang asked me to go larger. I think we need to prepare for Ukraine-like and Georgia-like operations more broadly. You asked the issue about other countries that aren't in NATO. I also believe that NATO cannot be considered to be safe or off limits. And NATO has obviously thought hard about so-called Article 5 contingencies. What I would describe as Article 4.5 contingencies might even be more difficult and more relevant. Not where we have Russian tank divisions coming across the border, but we have the sort of things we've seen in Georgia and Ukraine. And we, I believe, need to do more planning at the political level, the intelligence level, the military level, for how we would react to, both deter and react to, this sort of irregular Russian paramilitary activity, using forces, using active measures, using locals. So the Ukraine, rather than being seen as an exception, actually becomes potentially a precedent. And we ought not to think that somehow NATO is safe simply because countries are in NATO. One last point. I testified about a week ago before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And the Senate is preparing all sorts of legislation to put greater pressure on Russia. One of the questions, though, is in the course of it, how much greater pressure they put on Europe. And whereas the administration is focusing on levels of defense spending, what the Congress is going to focus much more on is levels of energy dependence. And this issue of how to adopt a trajectory of reduced energy dependence on Russia, I believe, will become an increasing priority out of the United States. And I would think coming up with a trajectory for that ought to be an increasing priority for the countries of Western Europe.
Thanks, Richard. I would like to invite questions or comments from the audience. We have less than 10 minutes remaining, but please, if you have a comment or a question, identify yourself, if you could, and tell us to whom you address your question or your comment, to the entire panel or to one of the members. I saw a gentleman over there, please.
Yes, my name is Emmanuel Zingeris. I'm a 7 times elected parliamentarian from Lithuania, and I was together with my parliamentary friends from Ukraine 5 years ago on 28th of November, when Yanukovych, during our chairmanship, Lithuanian chairmanship in European Union, when we invited Ukraine to sign association agreement, said no, and Petro Poroshenko, Boris Tarasyuk, Vitaly Klitschko said yes, and Maidan started in Vilnius by your invitation. And after 5 years, we have amazing contribution of Ukraine to European way, and I would like to congratulate you with these 5 years of Euro changes. But now my question will be to the catalog, to Russia, catalog of their, what they will lose if they will continue their adventures in Ukraine, their pressure, their taking over not only territories, but influencing possible the elections, not only United States, but in their neighborhood. We have in Lithuania elections too of president, and we're extremely worried about Russian possible intervening to our elections. And we would like to know probably from Kurt Volker how we can increase the cost for Russia making such adventures and intervening and trying to destroy our democratic life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pierre Lelouch. We'll collect one more and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the risk of being a little bit controversial, Richard, I am worried about when strategies don't work, it's about time to challenge the strategy. In Syria, we had a strategy on Russia which completely collapsed, which was one of not talking to them. At the end of the day, you and the European are excluded, and it's between the Russians, the Iranians, and the Turks. Not a great success. In Ukraine, a country that I love very much, tried to help for the last 20 years, the least you can say is that we are not making great progress either. Russian forces are still in Donbass. Crimea is essentially annexed, and we're talking of more sanction. And now your Congress is preparing sanction extraterritorial applying to European companies. As a European and as a former minister and legislator, let me tell you as a friend of the US that this attitude is totally unacceptable. As a sovereign state, I cannot let the United States decide whether I can trade or not trade with Russia, Ukraine, Iran, or anybody else on the whims of internal American politics. The truth of the matter today is that America has no longer a foreign policy, it's paralyzed. The Europeans cannot agree on a strategy. The Ukrainians have to wait until their next election to decide what they will do and whether they will do their part of the deal in Minsk. As to the Russians, they are the only one with a strategy, which is to continue to occupy. So, Richard, when it doesn't work, it's time to sit down and think of something else. The one thing that we are doing today, and I hear my colleague from the European Parliament add more sanction, more sanction. The point is, if you target the leadership in Russia, yes. If you're going to target the people and hurt them, you're only reinforcing Putin. So please, let us stop and think what is more effective. I haven't heard anything this morning to make me confident that we have a better strategy vis-à-vis Russia.
All right. Thank you. We have exactly 4 minutes or 3.5 minutes left. Who would like to, Richard, you need, and Pablo. And maybe Kurt gets the last word.
You have a former president.
Oh, President Kuchma, please. It works. Just, yeah.
Oh. I understand that the question that I want to ask will not be answered, and I'm not trying to get the answer, but first of all, I'm happy to have here Mr. Kurt Volker. We're always happy with his stand, and there is a hope that today it will be better than tomorrow it will be better than today. But my question is as follows. One of the foreign policy priorities of the President Trump is the Southern Korea and its non-nuclear status. I want to get back to Ukraine with this regard. Based on Budapest format, Ukraine decided to reject the nuclear weapons. The signatories were the nuclear club, including the United States, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and then even China joined that memorandum. And on the day two, they forgot about the guarantees of security and territorial integrity for Ukraine. My question is, what could we advise to President Trump? What will be his arguments for Southern Korea? If in this case 5 countries made their promises and nothing happened, what kind of guarantees Trump has to extend to Southern Korea to make them believe that his signature will give any result in the future? Let's think about the cost of our signatures.
That's a great question. Thank you, Mr. President. Richard.
Okay, so
30 seconds.
very quickly. On the Korea, one of the reasons analysts like me believe North Korea will not give up their nuclear weapons, despite what President Trump says, is because of the Ukraine example. All these pledges were given. So I believe that North Korea will keep its nuclear weapons. And I think the strategic problem in a matter of years or decades will be that other countries in Northeast Asia are also not tempted to think about nuclear weapons. So we can have all the non-proliferation policy we want, but the example of Ukraine undermines most of our non-proliferation policy. Very quickly on Pierre's point, Syria shows that diplomacy cannot succeed when it is not based upon realities on the ground. The United States was never serious about getting involved in Syria. Bashar al-Assad has consolidated his position with Russian and Iranian help. Our diplomacy has been feckless because we have not had a serious on-the-ground policy. In the case of Ukraine, there are some things we have finally done. There are more things we could do. But I take your larger point about sanctions, and I argued just that to the Senate. We ought not turn what has been a conflict with Russia into a conflict across the Atlantic with our Europeans. We learned this in Helms-Burton. We've learned this in other situations. It would be a mistake to have indiscriminate sanctions which made Europe the collateral damage or the Russian people the collateral damage. If sanctions are used, they ought to be very targeted against Russian leaders.
Pablo, 30 seconds, and Kurt, 30 seconds. Then we have to close.
Points. I like your point about changing strategy. This strategy does not work, I agree. But your point about, in a way, upgrading Russia, my way, why not to try to downgrade Russia? Russia is already downgraded as society, as an economy. You agree? Let's downgrade Russia also in a security sense. And why not to get proactive? With Russia has been trying basically to mess it up and to weaken up everyone. No, the Western approach now is top-down, basically, with one person representing the Russian state. But Russia, not the Russian state, is not represented by one person. Very simple point. And on North Korea, very short. Look, I believe the chance to sort out North Korea was basically wasted years ago. And with this chance wasted, we are in a completely different situation. 20 years ago, it would have been far more easier to sort it out, but it was not possible, again, with Russia and with China, and of course with some other countries.
Let us not forget that our sanctions are our civilian answer to a military aggression. We are not responding in the 21st century in Europe with military means like Russia does. And if he expected that, I don't think he did, but he did not even expect our civilian answer. And I think it's also a political issue to maintain the sanctions as long as the reason for why they were imposed have not been remedied. And that is what we should do. And as he would like us to drop them, apparently it hurts them anyhow. And I think that is what we can say at this point.
Kurt, last word.
First off, we support that civilian answer to military aggression. We also stand by Ukraine's right to self-defense and are prepared to help Ukraine in its efforts to strengthen its defense capabilities. Second, to Pierre, I just have my good friend, but I do disagree on one point. Ukraine has made tremendous progress. In the last 4 years, Ukraine has found its identity, something that was not as clear before that, and Ukraine has become a dynamic European country in that process. Ukraine has also done its share on the Minsk agreements. It has passed a special status law. It has passed a law on amnesty. It is prepared to hold local elections. The problem is that it can't implement these things as long as it's an occupied territory. And so we need to keep the focus on getting it unoccupied. And if I could say, it's very important that Ukraine renew the special status law as well to avoid giving Russia an opportunity to use that to beat up Ukraine just on this point of not doing its share. And on sanctions, as I said earlier, I believe sanctions are working, and it's not the only thing we're doing. We've taken other steps as well. And we have to, the other thing that came up in the panel yesterday, transparency. It is critically important that we expose and talk clearly and frankly about what it is that Russia is doing with cyber attacks, with our elections, with its invasion, so that people know what's happening, and then people will make their own conclusions about whether they think that's good for their country.
Thank you very much. As we conclude this panel, we're 2 minutes over time. I want to remind you that there is no break now. The next session will start immediately, run by our host, Viktor Pinchuk himself. Simply to conclude, let me insist that if there is one thing that I am very determined to do is to use the platform that you are offering, Viktor, here, and to continue our joint efforts in Munich to press home some of these issues and keep discussing also with Russians about how we can take this forward. Our next conference will be in Minsk at the end of October, and I look forward to welcoming quite a few of the people assembled in this room to Munich in next February. Let's thank this wonderful panel and invite the next one up to the stage. Thank you very much.